Grüß. Willkommen in einem aufregendes video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 3 of my organisational series of videos. In this video I wish to cover the Prussian army between 1806 and 1815. I know this particular painting that you see now has nothing to do with the Napoleonic War, but I do like it, and so that's why it's there. I created this series of videos in order to assist with my efforts in creating army lists, but the bulk of the video is a historical analysis of the TO&E, or in German, Gliederungen, of the Prussian army between the years of 1806 and 1815. Only the last part will cover converting this into a force mix for a figure gamer, so those not interested in figure gaming should still get something out of this video. My preferred method is to pick a battle and use the force mixes available to be the guide for any army list, but I decided to try and look at the issues of army lists from the other end. What is the official organisation of the force mix in question before the battle? Using a battle force mix is useful when creating a battle or recreating a battle, but I wanted to look at a more generic competition or competition style games where players would build up a force mix based on reasonable options which may have been historically available to them. There are many issues with this approach, and it's something I generally avoided in the past, but I noticed that Garde du Corps rules make an attempt in this direction. This shows the Garde du Corps data for the Prussian army. The key values to consider here is the first number, which represents the number of units, and the last number, which represents the number of figures, each representing 60 men in the unit. This initially got me rather excited until I realised it's filled with quite understandable errors. For example, the 57 line infantry regiments each consist of 9 figures or 540 men, which may be correct if it's a battalion, but this is supposed to represent a regiment. The value of 57 is correct in terms of regiments, but the actual regimental strength, which went to war, consisted typically of 2 battalions, each consisting of 5 companies of 155 men. If you do the maths, you'll quickly discover that it's not really that accurate. On the other hand, and strangely enough, the grenadier values are correct. There were 28 regular grenadier battalions, each consisting of 4 companies of 189 men, and a guard grenadier battalion of unknown strength. Based on this, a player could field a very unbalanced force mix with too many grenadiers and too few line infantry. Unfortunately, my hope this data would make my job of determining the TO&E of the Prussian army was kind of dashed. However, apart from this, the basic concept has merit, and I've decided to conduct a historical analysis of the Prussian army in this period to see if I could possibly correct the numbers. Just a quick note, there's good reason why the TO&E that you see here can't be correct, because a historical force mix tends to not field the kind of forces that most players would want to field. So as a result, it's kind of skewed in lots of cavalry, lots of elite units, etc. Not so much crud units or basic trained units. So I get it and I understand it. But nonetheless, I wanted to see what actually was a historical ratio of troops. A lot of the source material that I'm using comes from the excellent Napoleonic Battles by Ray Johnson. Another source I use is the excellent Armies of the Napoleonic Era by Otto von Pifka. This shows the English front cover on the right. While I do not possess this specific book, I must admit this looks like a very interesting reference document which I will purchase. I found it on Scribd, which is a site that I have very little experience with. I have to assume it's safe, but anyone who wishes to access this may be wise to be cautious, at least initially. A quick caveat, this is an overview of this topic and not an in-depth historically enlightened analysis. I am sure others possess superior knowledge and experience in this topic, but those who wish a layman's analysis, in this particular case of the Prussian army, then this video is for you. Before we get into the details of the TO&E of the Prussian army, I'll first provide a brief overview of the different troop types which the Prussians employed, and as I will be describing units based on these troop types. In the most part, it's self-evident, but some names really are confusing and are seeped in history with a meaning in the long, long dead past. The foot guards were line infantry which were specifically selected, trained and equipped. They may not have had as much experience as a veteran formation, but they certainly had a high morale and willingness to take risks. The high level of training would help them equal a veteran formation, especially in attack, and their esprit de corps would allow them to take casualties or risk no other formation would be likely to do so. My sources show a Guard regiment and a Guard battalion in 1806. The 1st Foot Guard Regiment, soldier shown here, was formed in November 1806, after the disaster of Jena Austerlitz. My sources indicate it was made up of surviving Foot Guard regiments, although I have found it rather difficult to get much detail of exactly which Foot Guard regiments it was sourced from. Grenadiers were line infantry made up of the largest men, which was similar in most other armies of the period. Being large would assist in hand-to-hand combat, thus these troops would be useful in urban fighting or as shock troops designed to break through the enemy line. They're basically heavy and big infantry. Apart from one battalion of Guard Grenadiers, the Grenadiers were distributed throughout all the line infantry regiments, with each regiment containing 2 companies of Grenadiers. When the army was to march, these were combined into 4 company-strength Grenadier battalions, and in some cases remained in the same brigade as the parent regiments, or in some cases were concentrated further. Often referred to as converted or converged Grenadiers, as the formations were created by converging a separate companies from different regiments. The line infantry were the backbone of the army, a musketeer which moved and fought in formation. While this formation, as all infantry, could disperse and move in an irregular manner, this was not normally their normal fighting mode, and they generally proved ineffective as skirmishers. The reserve infantry were a type of line infantry used in or between 1813 and 1814. They were created to overcome the French restrictions after 1807. Basically, troops would conduct some training and then were discharged, ready to be called up when required. Initially, they lacked recent experience and proved inferior to the more practiced regular line infantry, but by the end of 1814, if not the end of 1813, were highly experienced, and in 1815 the distinction was removed. The Landwehr, or land army, was made up of untrained troops or older soldiers, or other soldiers too old, or men too young. The concept was not new, but the Landwehr became a people's army filled with national patriotism. The issue was that they lacked equipment, training, experience. The Landwehr regiments lacked Fusilier battalions and, as a result, skirmishers. Although special Landwehr Jager companies were formed to help overcome this issue. Some of the regiments performed very badly in 1813, but some did surprisingly well. By 1815, they were better equipped and better armed and could hold their own against standard opponents. The Fusiliers were light infantry of the line infantry, capable of standard line infantry combat and formation forming. They were also trained to skirmish and act as light infantry. Each brigade normally had 2 battalions. One was split and placed on each flank, and the others formed a line in the centre front and sent its 3rd rank forward to act as the skirmishers. I'm uncertain if they were made up of smaller men, as the French light infantry or regiments, but it appears they were highly trained, as in 1806 4 of the battalions made up the Advanced Guard Division. Jager were the skirmish troops of the Prussian army, particularly from 1812 onwards, trained to fight as skirmishers and normally deployed in company-sized formations. They could be armed with a musket or rifle, but most Jagers were musket-armed and trained as sharp shooters. Schützen is a term often used to describe rifle-armed Jager. The word itself means to screen, so it's not specifically linked to the use of a rifle, but by 1815 the orders of battle normally referred to rifle-armed Jager as Schützen. The Garde du Corps were Guard heavy cavalry, classed as cuirassiers by the Prussians, although they did not wear a cuirass in 1806, and probably at any time in the Napoleonic War. The Garde du Corps were the king's bodyguard, in theory at least. The cuirassiers were the Prussian heavy cavalry and was made up of large men on large horses. My sources indicate they did not wear a cuirass in 1806, but did wear it between 1813 and 1815 on occasion. The cuirass was very uncomfortable to wear, and the cavalrymen often avoided wearing it. However, it became clear this protection was rather useful in battle, so the more experienced troops did wear it more and more as the war continued. The dragoons were the Prussian medium cavalry, classed as heavy in most sources. The horses were still larger and the men used a straight sword designed to thrust forward, as with the cuirassiers, but the horses weren't quite as large. They were also equipped with a carbine and could in theory fire them from their saddle, but for the most part they were used in the same manner as cuirassiers. Originally mounted infantry, I think only the French used this type of cavalry in a mounted infantry manner, but it's also possible the Prussians could dismount their dragoons and they could fight on foot. The hussars were light cavalry, and of all the light cavalry had the reputation of being party animals. They had small but fast and mobile horses, were armed with a sabre that was designed to fight other cavalry from the side rather than forward. They were very effective in exploiting any breakthroughs and riding down fleeing enemy infantry or even cavalry, which is why they were often at the rear of a brigade ready to exploit such an occurrence. The Toasi were lance-armed uhlans recruited from the Polish minor nobility. As such, in 1806 they were a type of elite formation, later just called uhlans, or lance-armed light cavalry, and were less elite in nature. These were lance-armed light cavalry which could fulfill the same function as hussars, but also had a very good anti-cavalry capability because they used a lance. The poor man's shock cavalry in many ways. Using a lance was not easy to do effectively, so they were rarely inexperienced soldiers, and it required quite a bit of training in order to use it correctly. The Landwehr cavalry were light lance-armed cavalry, in the most part, raised on small horses and with men which lacked a lot of training. The lance was a simple weapon which could be quickly issued, but did require sufficient training to use effectively against other cavalry. On the other hand, against infantry, even inexperienced troops could be highly effective with the lance. Some sources mention reserve cavalry, which was actually just more experienced and better trained Landwehr cavalry, which was often armed with a sabre or a carbine, as in this example, rather than a lance. The Prussian army can be divided into a number of basic periods during the Napoleonic War. This video's main objective is to look at the structure of the Prussian army during each of these individual periods. While historical, I will not be covering the colours of the buttons used on the coats of specific troopers. This is a pure TO&E analysis. I should also point out that the official strengths rarely reflect the actual battlefield strengths. As this video will be covering official strengths and the structures of the various formations, please take this into note. This is perhaps the main problem with using official strengths in the creation of an army list, and I suspect in the end I will fall back to the good old-fashioned orders of battles of specific battles. However, in many cases accurate values will not be present, and knowing the official strength of a formation may assist in determining what a reasonable battlefield strength could be. The Prussian army of 1806 possessed no permanent structure greater than a regiment, or in the case of the Fusiliers, a brigade. This shows the official formations of the Prussian army during peacetime. When the army needed to take the field, this would alter a great deal when on a war footing, and a lot of reorganisations would occur. The line regiments would split off the grenadier companies to form grenadier battalions. For example, the line infantry regiments also allocated its 3rd battalion as garrison and depot battalions, which is one reason why you do not see 3-pounder guns in most battles of the period. Some of these formations were split apart, so the chasseur de cheval was used for courier purposes, and the artillery regiments were obviously also broken up as well and distributed to the brigades. The Guard Infantry Regiment consisted of 3 battalions of 6 companies of 135 men. 2 6-pounder cannons were allocated to each battalion in time of war. The Grenadier battalions were normally separate from the regiment and would report directly to the division. As previously mentioned, this formation was probably formed at the end of 1806 and the latter half of 1806-07 conflict. This shows an entire line infantry regiment during peacetime. The 3rd Small Battalion in the Reserve Company was not taken to the field and used as garrison and depot troops. Personally, knowing you were going to fight the largest military in Europe, I would have probably taken everyone I could with me to battle, but I understand this was done for cost reasons and you have to garrison The two grenadier companies were split off and formed grenadier battalions, which were normally in the same infantry brigade. Each infantry battalion received a pair of 6-pounder cannons, which for battalion guns seems a bit large. These guns were heavy and would not be able to keep up with the infantry while being manhandled, but I would expect would be useful in defence. The Fusiliers and Jagers were distributed to each of the divisions under the Light Brigade, although the Prussians also used the Fusiliers in their advance guard. There were 27 battalions of these light troops, which was distributed across the 14 divisions. While the Fusiliers would have been capable of skirmishing, in 1806 these formations were used as fast infantry, which indicated they were manned by young and robust men. The 14 Prussian divisions required 28 regiments of heavy and medium cavalry, of which the Prussians possessed 27 regiments, excluding the Garde du Corps. The Garde du Corps regiment was part of the Guards. Most of the light cavalry was allocated to the divisions. The Prussians did have a battalion formation in their light regiment, each of which consisted of 5 squadrons. This specific cavalry battalion structure disappeared after 1807. The final part of the puzzle is the artillery formations, which were normally kept at brigade level in peacetime and allocated out as required during the war. The howitzers were not fielded during the 1806 battles, again for economy reasons. When Prussia went to war in 1806, it organised its field army into divisions, which were not formal structures with permanent officers in place. A typical division, of which there were 14, consisted of 3 infantry brigades, 1 cavalry brigade and a light brigade. The infantry brigade consisted of 2 regiments, a grenadier battalion and a foot artillery battery. The foot artillery battery came from the artillery regiments and the grenadiers were taken from the line infantry regiments. The cavalry brigade consisted of 2 heavy or medium cavalry regiments, each of which consisted of 5 squadrons and a horse artillery battery. Just a note, I use the battalion symbol for cavalry squadrons as the battalion represented a basic building block and is the US convention. The British would have used the company symbol in this case. The Prussians did have actual cavalry battalions, which consisted of 5 squadron and reported to a regiment. When by itself it was called a regiment, or if heavy cavalry and in some cases medium cavalry. All this is rather confusing. The cavalry would be a mix of cuirassiers and dragoons. The light battalion consisted of fusiliers or Jager battalions and a light cavalry regiment. For the most part the light cavalry would be hussars, but it's possible some could be Polish uhlans as well. This shows the actual order of battle of the 1st and 2nd Division at Austerlitz. If anything, the numbers are greater than the official structure would indicate, which is not surprising as the numbers I used were based on the companies only. Additional troops would be present at regimental, brigade and divisional level, or allocated anyway. One point which I do find puzzling is the mention of 4-pounder horse artillery batteries, which I was not aware the Prussians possessed. The same applies to the 9-pounder foot artillery battery. One of my 2 sources must be in error. As this came from Wikipedia from memory, I suspect the Wikipedia is the error area. The most significant dividing line is between 1807 and 1808. The Prussian army of 1806-7 was basically dismantled, reorganised and rebuilt from the ground up between 1808 and 1813. This ground-up reorganisation was one reason why the army was so resilient in the 1813-15 period, considering its low numbers, poor equipment and rapid expansion. Many of the reforms which made the greater difference were generally invisible, such as the general staff structure. These changes will not be covered in this video, as the main focus here is only the structure of the army. 1808 was the year of reorganisation, and we will pass that and go to the final structure of the 1809 Prussian army. The brigade was becoming a semi-permanent structure, and this image shows the Guard Brigade on the left and the 5 standard brigades on the right. However, this was not the structure which would be used when going to war. Actually, when Prussia did go to war in 1813, this changed rather dramatically. This was the typical corps structure. The Prussians did not possess 11 infantry brigades, so obviously this structure assumed mass mobilisation of the reserve regiments. Initially, only 1 brigade would be available per so-called corps. When you look at the cavalry strength, this is also rather obvious. This pre-planning was what allowed Prussia to mobilise such a large force in such a short or small period of time in 1813, and while not perfect, it was an impressive in its execution. Obviously, the only corps which was raised was the one sent to Russia during Napoleon's invasion of Russia, although it was not very large, and it was called an auxiliary corps consisting of 16,000 to 20,000 men only. Sorry, it's not large by Prussian standards. By most other corps-sized formations, it was a reasonably large formation. The infantry regiments experienced significant changes, with the Fusiliers now being part of the Line Infantry Regiment. In 1806, the lack of light infantry, or to be specific, skirmishers, where and when it was needed, was a major part of the poor showing of the Prussians, and that mistake was never going to occur again. The boundary between 1812 and 1813 is the next most significant dividing line. While during the 1808 and 1812 periods, the main focus was reorganising and rebuilding the army, with a boost occurring in 1812 due to Napoleon's invasion of Russia, it was the raising of the reserve and Landwehr regiments in 1813, which was the rising of the phoenix, so to speak. Many short-term experiments were attempted, the Fricourt being the most colourful, but the wide-ranging raising of the Landwehr was possibly the most significant experiment the Prussians undertook. This shows the basic building blocks of the Prussian army after the mobilisation in 1813. This took time to accomplish, and it was not until late in 1813 that the Prussians had effectively an effective operating force in the field, which did not require Russian support. The key point was the 12 reserve regiments were manned by troops previously trained up and demobilised. As their training was either very basic or the troops very rusty, they did not initially perform as well as the regulars, but by the end of 1813 and certainly by 1814 were performing adequately. The other significant point is the Landwehr. These were truly unprepared troops, and their numbers were massive. In some cases they performed very badly, and others they did reasonably well, particularly in defence. It would take a lot longer for the Landwehr to gain anywhere near the proficiency required to match the reserve, much less the regulars, but they certainly were enthusiastic. The Prussians mitigated this by mixing Landwehr and regular and reserve troops together. It was not perfect, but it worked and gave the Prussians 4 large corps in 1813. The Prussians sent their guard formations to join the Russian guards. The cavalry brigade consisted of between 2 and 3 cavalry regiments, each consisting of 4 squadrons. The artillery brigade consisted of 3 12-pounders, 6 6-pounders, and 3 6-pounder horse artillery batteries. There was a single howitzer battery, but I'm uncertain where it was allocated in 1813. The Prussian 1813 corps was very large, with 4 infantry brigades, between 1 and 2 cavalry brigades, and an artillery brigade. The 4th Corps was made up entirely of Landwehr and reserves, and was not as effective as the first 3 corps. The infantry brigade consisted of regular, reserve and Landwehr regiments. In addition, either a single grenadier or 2 Jager companies were attached. The cavalry's support came in the form of line or Landwehr light cavalry regiments, and an artillery battery was attached. The cavalry brigade consisted of between 2 and 3 cavalry regiments, which in turn were made up of 4 squadrons of cavalry. The cavalry was a mix of regular, reserve and Landwehr cavalry. Each corps required a total between 6 and 10 cavalry regiments, requiring up to 40 cavalry regiments for all 4 corps. As there were only 22 regular and 5 reserve cavalry regiments, the gaps were filled with Landwehr cavalry. The artillery brigade consisted of 3 heavy, 4 medium foot batteries of artillery and 3 horse artillery batteries. As the Prussians only had 50 batteries in total, this possibly represented an ideal strength, with the actual strength being much less. The 3rd Corps at Leipzig only had 2 12-pounder and 1 6-pounder and 1 horse artillery battery in their reserves, although it had an additional 3 6-pounder and 2 6-pounder horse artillery batteries with other formations elsewhere. The artillery which was allocated to the infantry brigade came from this pool, so may have been double counted here. As we can see from this actual order of battle of the Prussian 3rd Corps at Leipzig, 16 to 18 October 1813, the reality was very different from theory. The Prussians had been fighting for many months and were in the process of a rapid mobilisation, so this can be expected. The infantry brigade consisted of 3 infantry regiments, a grenadier regiments, or in some cases 2 Jager companies, cavalry regiment and an artillery battery. This was a reasonably large formation for a brigade. The regular and reserve regiments were organised in a similar manner, each possessing fusiliers and grenadiers. The grenadier companies were merged and formed a grenadier battalion, in theory. However, most orders of battle do not include these formations, such as with the 3rd Corps shown previously. In most cases, Jager companies were present. I'm uncertain where the grenadiers went. My guess is that they may have been concentrated with the guards, which were with the Russian Guard formations, or corps-size formation. The Landwehr regiments lacked any fusiliers or grenadiers. As a result, it possessed very poor skirmish capability and required support from Jager companies. Later in the war, the Landwehr raised specific Jager detachments, which were allocated to the Landwehr regiments. While I'm not 100% certain, I have to assume in most cases companies of Jager or Schutzen were attached to the brigade rather than grenadiers. Due to the lack of an effective organic skirmishing capability in the Landwehr, this was a critical requirement. Each brigade contained 4 squadrons of cavalry, which was an integral part of the brigade attack formation. These were normally placed at the rear of the attack column or on either side of the artillery battery. The artillery was normally placed in the centre at the rear. To the front of the artillery, only a line of fusiliers were deployed. Thus, I assume if the fusiliers were cleared by an enemy counterattack, that force would face cannon and hostile battalions on either flank, as well as a possible follow-up cavalry charge. The 5th Brigade at Leipzig, 16-18 October 1813, was very close to an ideal structure. It consisted of 7,760 men and 8 guns, and in this order of battle we can see the Grenadier Battalion. The cavalry consisted of Line Hussars and Ulan regiments. The boundary between 1814 and 1815, there was no real significant changes which occurred in this boundary, and it more represents an evolutionary change to what had already been decided in 1814. The Prussian army, after the experience of 1813-14, had created its winning formula, and in 1815 it was all about building on these foundations. This shows the overall Prussian army of 1815, which included the corps held back in Prussia. The biggest change was the conversion of the reserve regiments into regular regiments. The Landwehr were normally 3 battalion strengths, that's the Landwehr regiments, or at least all the orders of battle I could find indicate this structure. During the Waterloo campaign, I could not find any grenadier battalions attached to the brigade, but many brigades had Schutzen and Jager attached, the 1st Brigade having 2 companies attached, for example. During the Waterloo campaign, most of the brigades did not have any cavalry. The 1st Brigade had a Hussar regiment, but most of its squadrons were not present when this formation met the French, at least initially. This shows the 1st Infantry Brigade, which was part of the 1st Corps. The artillery was attached to this brigade from the Corps Artillery Brigade, and you can see there were 2 companies of Schutzen, as well as attached Jager with the Landwehr regiment. During the Waterloo campaign, 2 corps had 2 cavalry brigades and 2 had 3 cavalry brigades. The 1st Corps possessed 2 cavalry brigades of 4 and 3 regiments each. The cavalry was growing compared with what occurred in 1813-14, but seems to be placed under corps command rather than distributed towards among the brigades. The 1st Corps consisted of the 1st and 2nd Cavalry Brigade. The 1st Cavalry Brigade consisted of 4 cavalry regiments, all of which were regular. The 2nd Cavalry Brigade was mainly made up of Landwehr cavalry. All the artillery came from the Artillery Brigade, and 4 6-pounder batteries would have been allocated to the infantry brigades, 1 per brigade. This source shows a single 8-pounder battery, perhaps captured from the French in the previous war, or previous year campaign. 1 horse artillery battery was allocated to each of the cavalry brigades, with the 1st Corps only possessing 3 horse artillery batteries, so there was 1 spare in this case. This shows the artillery reserve of the 1st Corps. This corps contained the howitzer battery. There were 3 horse artillery batteries, which I find surprising. I'm uncertain if any of the foot artillery consisted of 8-pounders, as this order of battle does not include this artillery type. For those not interested in actual figure gaming, then this video from this point on uses the data so far collected in creating army lists, so those folks may wish to exit the video now. For those interested in figure gaming, then this section from here on attempts to convert the division, brigade and corps TO&E into a force mix for a set of figure gaming rules. No specific set of rules are being modelled, instead I will model based on figure scale, starting with a typical 50 men per infantry figure. For higher scales, such as 100 men per figure, you can simply halve the number of elements and so on. In order to convert the TO&E into a force mix for a game, we need to use one of the magic ratios. This is one example, and all these elements would occupy a similar frontage. For example, at 50 men per figure and 4 figures per base, the frontage would be about 40 metres. The same applies with the cavalry and artillery, although it must be pointed out there is obviously some variability. I'll use these ratios for my force mix. If playing a higher scale, simply multiply these values by 2, 3 or more. Thus, a set of rules where an infantry element represents 100 or 1,000 men, the infantry scale is 5 times what is shown here. The artillery element, in this case, would represent 20 guns. Clearly, this is not divisible by most artillery battery strengths, but does give us a starting point from which players can make whatever fine-tuning they wish. Using the principle of always rounding down and staying with whole elements, we end up with an infantry regiment consisting of 6 infantry elements and an element of artillery. The Grenadier Battalion consists of 3 elements of 4 figures and 1 artillery element. In this case, we are using the leftover guns from the regiment to fill out the Grenadier Artillery. Finally, we have 2 elements of 6 pounders. The Cavalry Brigade consists of 2 regiments, which total 18 cavalry elements and 2 elements of horse artillery. The Light Brigade consists of 18 light cavalry elements and 4 elements of Jager in skirmish formation. We now have a division total of 64 elements, which is about the most a player could field in a game, which would end within a 4 to 6 hour period. This makes a good force mix for a set of rules such as WRG, Garde du Corps, or any similar scale set of rules where the player is expected to command no more than a single corps. One observation is that there is a lot of artillery and cavalry in this force mix, more than I would typically expect to field. This could be the use of the 2 cavalry per element basing, but we are dealing with troops which would typically occupy the same frontage, and this is the answer which comes out using that formula. Some sources claim a horse had a frontage of 1 pace rather than 1 metre. If this is correct, then basing the cavalry 3 to a base may be optional, but most reasonable sources indicate that 1 metre per horse was a reasonable frontage when 2 lines met, so I will stay with this frontage. I also suspect you'd need a rather thin horse for 1 pace width. This represents our infantry brigade, 1813 to 14. Each group of 4 elements represents a battalion. At 47 elements, this is probably the most you'd want to field in a typical game. There is no way you could field an entire corps and expect to have a game which lasts a single day or only a single day. If you adopt an infantry figure scale of 1 in 200, then this force mix would represent all 4 brigades. You would then need to add the cavalry brigade and reserve artillery, which would add 5 to 10 extra cavalry elements, 2 horse artillery elements, and 2 12-pounder foot artillery elements, which is a large force mix but feasible for a typical one-day game. But at a scale of 50 to 1, all you could field is a brigade, as you can see here. The 1815 brigade would be similar in size and composition to the 1813-14 brigade. The real difference is if we move to a corps formation using a figure scale of 200 to 1. In that case, expect much more cavalry. Obviously, the morale and quality of the troops would be superior, but that's not what we're covering in this video. We now come back to the Garde du Corps data. This shows the data for Prussia corrected by my analysis. If we look at the line regiments or line infantry regiments, 06 to 08 entry, this means there are 57 units. Each unit consists of 24 figures of line infantry. Each figure represents 60 men. The figure scale for these rules is 1 in 60. The 5D is the melee grade and the morale grade, with A and B being guard or elite, C being veteran, and so on. In this case, the morale grade is D, which means it's average or standard regular troops. Garde du Corps uses different descriptions this is my generic interpretation of their game system. The 5 is its melee grade, with 5 sitting around the centre of the range of 1 to 10. As you can see, the Grenadiers at 9 are much better in melee, with the Laib Hussars being the standout at 10. I have no comments on the accuracies of these values, and they are dependent on the game system. But I find it's interesting seeing what others people's opinion is of such a difficult to pin down comparison for any set of rules, actually. And so we come to an end of episode 3, in this case covering the Prussian army between the years of 1806 and 1815. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.